incarceration rates in the world, that the racial dimension of mass incarceration is its most striking feature, and that in some states, black men have been admitted to prison on drug charges at rates 20 to 50 times greater than white men. Bryan Stevenson has noted that Alabama, in the buckle of the Bible Belt, still had a ban on interracial marriage in the 21st century. The voice of this book seeks to be, as evangelical voices in our day generally do, gospel-centered. But the question must be raised, whose gospel? The gospel Jesus preached, see Mark chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, announced the availability through him of life in the kingdom of God, the range of God's effective will. And God's will includes definite parameters about dignity, equality, social structures, and economic fairness. Jesus came, notes Yale philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff, as the Spirit-anointed servant who proclaims the coming of justice, and any account of gospel that ignores the social content of God's effective will is not the gospel that Jesus proclaimed. This is not a book without hope, but it's not my place to speak of hope. Hope can come too glibly to the tongue for those who have sat at the table of privilege too easily for too long. So it may be helpful for the reader to start with a willingness to bear discomfort. Any hope worth having is willing to start there and stay there. John Ortberg. Part 1. An Evangelical Eulogy. Chapter 1. Listen. While the fires of the Great Awakening were inflaming souls up and down the eastern seaboard of America, a slave had found himself enraptured by the preaching of George Whitefield. Alone in the confines of his quarters, he decided to pay the theatrical gospel preacher the ultimate form of flattery, namely, impersonation. Unbeknownst to him, standing outside the door was his master, totally enamored by what his property was doing. Others had to see this, he thought. So he sent out a call to some of his friends, poured a few glasses of whiskey, and summoned his slave for an encore performance. The sight of a slave trying to pull off a British accent overwhelmed them with laughter. But in the midst of doubling over, something happened, and it wasn't the whiskey. An eerie sense of seriousness hovered over the room, as these men began to contemplate the sobriety of the cross. The gospel began to eke out of this vaudevillian performance. Things were no longer funny. This story presents far more than sermonic fodder for the potency of the gospel. I have felt like this slave during my sojourn in the land of white evangelicalism. Many of my invitations to speak to majority white audiences come because of my ability to strike safe, homiletical chords, also hit by our modern-day George Whitefields. In the infancy of my ministry, I found myself simply parroting the words of these well-known white evangelicals without wrestling with these truths before embracing them as mine. My imitation of them earned me entree to white audiences, much like what happened with this slave. On more than a few occasions, I have been told by my white hosts how boring white preachers can be and how entertaining black ones are. I've been asked by the white leaders who've invited me to speak at their event if I'm going to whoop, and if I'm going to bring it. These questions inspire a gladiatorial neurosis of sorts, in which I want to scream, "I do not entertain." And as I've stood before a sea of white faces throughout my ministry, I have wrestled with feelings of belonging, as this slave undoubtedly did as he took his stand before his communion-consuming gathering. And yet, through all of this, the gospel somehow does its thing. Unconfined by human brokenness, the foolishness of the good news leaks out across oppression, racism, and bad motives. My Nana had it right when she said, "God hits straight licks with crooked sticks." The history of evangelicalism in America begins with the Puritans. Even a cursory reading of their writings and knowledge of their history will reveal a deep passion for God and an honest attempt to live by the scriptures. Their books have a unique quality of inflaming the soul. I've read them, I know. Yet our nation's evangelical ancestors had feet of clay and were deeply misguided in a plethora of ways, especially when it came to race. Many owned slaves. For example, Cotton Mather had slaves included in his compensation package when he became the pastor of a church. He